with you guys. I don't have a huge amount to talk about this week. This is a breather episode. No, I don't want to update Java. And as a result, there's not really a lot going on. But what I like about this is they could have done just about any type of breather episode. We've actually talked about this concept many times. In many forms of fiction, not least of which being, of course, television. So, obviously, there's some real benefit to having an episode where it's just like, okay, everyone take a breath. Okay. You know, it helps to establish tone, it helps to keep you invested, it helps to make sure you don't get overwhelmed by things happening, you know, all that fun stuff. It's all good stuff. But most of the time, when episodes do a breather episode, they either do a slice in the life, or like a comedy episode, or at least something lighthearted, you know. This is none of those. In fact, this is a very dark, very serious episode. It covers a little bit of things here and there, basically just acknowledging some of the stuff that's been happening in the continuing arc as it continues to progress. But the majority of the episode is all about Delenn and backstory. The majority of the episode is basically filling in some holes in the backstory and the I guess, history, for lack of a better term, of both the Minbari human war, Delenn in particular, and other circumstances related thereto. A lot of info dumping, in other words. It's an interesting way to do it, and this and the next several episodes are kind of going to be all about Delenn. This one, of course, is about where Delenn came from. This is who Delenn was. Now, I don't have... Before we get more into the Delenn thing, I just want to nail a couple of quick points, then we'll finish up on the Delenn stuff. First of all, notice how Zack finally has a uniform that fits. He says it doesn't, but you can clearly see his uniform does actually fit. The metaphor continuing from the last time his uniform didn't fit, when now he's finally being put into the Army of Light uniform, and he's finally found a uniform that fits him. The only reason he's actually uncomfortable about it is because he doesn't want to take Garibaldi's spot. Because, I mean, Garibaldi's coming back. Right? Right? I could keep going with the symbolism of that, but I think most of it speaks for itself. Also, before I forget, let's go ahead and point out that third space probably happens around this episode, either immediately prior to it, or during it, or whatever. It's somewhere around this point in history in which third space happens. For the record, I've decided to approach each Babylon 5 mini-movie on its own merits to decide whether or not I'm going to look at them or not. And I have decided not to look at third space. I don't really have much to say, and to be blunt, I don't like it that much. So if I was going to do a rumination on third space, it would be happening today, as opposed to, you know, Atonement. And I would look at Atonement either tomorrow or next week. I'm not sure where this is lining up. I'm just now setting up the calendar for the double Babylon 5 thing, now that I've committed to that. And I'm not sure where each episode's going to land yet. So right now I'm just recording a whole bunch of videos, and I'll figure out where they are on the calendar later. Jakar's jubilation at being able to see again is actually really nice. Usually, even in science fiction, when you lose an eye, that's kind of it. So it's got... He does a good job of demonstrating someone who's really very happy at the fact that he can actually see again. And we even get to see a nice shot of it. It even is exactly as Franklin described. A little bit of static here and there, but otherwise quite good. We'll change the coloration, of course, over the few weeks. Don't worry about that. And, of course, it works remotely. Just keep that in the back of your mind. There's several things the Minbari do here that reminded me of this. Now, I happen to have looked at Amok Time very recently for unrelated reasons. Not for rumination, I was just looking at it. And they have these, like, triangle bell things. They go, ch-ch-ch-ch-ch-ch. And the Vulcans have used these in, like, almost every presentation of the Vulcans. I mentioned that because the Minbari have these triangle bell things. Ch-ch-ch-ch. And that was my first thing that came to my mind. I was like, oh my god, I knew it! The Minbari are Vulcans! It makes so much sense now! And, of course, we see the, pretty much the next step, or I should say the next reaction, to the increased propaganda war that the Clark administration is using against Babylon 5. I'm not going to say much about this, but note the uniqueness of their tactic. The Clark administration's tactic, I mean. What they're doing is they are basically forcing Babylon 5 to either act now and tip their hand and therefore ensure that they gain more brownie points because, you know, if they act unprepared or if they act in a malicious way, then they win. then the Clark administration wins. Aha! See? They were evil. Duh. Or they were actually influenced by aliens is actually the tint they're going by. But you get my point. They're the bad guys. Or they sit and do nothing for fear of that, and the propaganda campaign gets worse until, well, Sheridan himself quotes the big lie in this episode. For those of you who haven't seen this episode, don't remember, or don't recall the quote, the point, the quote of the big lie is, the more you repeat it, the easier it becomes to believe it. Even if it's a big lie. Even if it's something ridiculous, you just keep repeating it, and repeating it, and repeating it. Eventually you start to believe it. I'm not sure, forgive me this pause, but what they're doing is actually riskier than I think they realize, the Clark administration. Because what they're presuming is that there are only two actions Babylon 5 can take. Military action now, which would be a win for the Clark administration, or delaying and doing nothing, which would be a win for the Clark administration. I bring this up because as much as it's a nice little propaganda tool, and it is intelligent, and it is in keeping with the Clark administration's tactics thus far, it's a little short-sighted. I guess we'll see how that turns out in the future. We get a really big insight into Minbari culture in this episode. We get to learn about the Minbari traditionalism. I've mentioned before how the Minbari are very prideful. There's this a lot of pomp and circumstance, a lot of you must not look at me, but you can only talk out of turn, but you can only do this, and all of that crap, right? Forgive me for saying that. I actually find Minbari culture fascinating and interesting, but they do have a lot of rigidity and traditionalism to the way they function. In fact, they have functioned basically the same way for billions of trillions of grillions of... Actually, it's about a millennia. But still, huge period of time. Then Dekat died. Now, I bring that up because obviously a lot of this episode revolves around Dekat's death, but what's really important is that Dekat died. He was the one of the 9. There were actually 10 Minbari leaders. I haven't actually brought this up yet because it hasn't been relevant yet. But the Minbari leadership traditionally, prior to the Earth Minbari War, was 10. 3 workers, 3 religious, 3 warrior, 1 leader to balance the 9. Created because Valen himself didn't want to limit himself to one of the castes, Sinclair, of course. So, 1 over 9, right? They never replaced Dekat. They never had another 1 over the 9. At least not that I remember. I could be wrong. Please forgive me. But this is relevant, because at least as far as when the show started, it was just the 9, no 1 in charge. Then, then after losing the 9, they lost equilibrium. Because then it was no longer 3-3-3, it was 3-2-4, or whatever the hell the actual spread was. Warrior taking a greater stand. Then they called for a removal of the 9, and so they no longer had 9, they had the 4 or whatever, because worker and religious walked out on them. Or maybe it was just religious walked out on them. I actually don't remember. I remember the scene. Delenn gives a great speech and says, no, we're going to fight the shadows, and then the people walk out with her. My point is, ever since encountering the humans, the closing of the loop, as it were, they've gone from their traditional leadership to less than their traditional leadership to unbalanced leadership to basically a lack of leadership. If you think about it politically, the Minbari are screwed right now. They don't have a lot of political infrastructure to deal with a problem like this. And that's going to be an issue, I think. There's also this great part, continuing, there's this great part where Delenn says, but I love him, is that not reason enough? No, it's not reason enough. I just want to make sure. And he says flat out later on that his actual motivation is to keep Minbari pure. We must all be of Minbari blood. Of course, we're not all of Minbari blood. At this point in history, it's actually statistically likely that there is no such thing as a pure Minbari anymore. I'm reminded, I don't know why Harry Potter keeps coming up in my ruminations, but I'm reminded of Harry Potter. The idea that the pure magical races, or excuse me, the pure magical families aren't, and haven't been for a while, really. That at some point or another, non-magical blood gets in there, because that's how heretics? That's how bloodlines work, for God's sakes. You can't just keep maintaining a pure bloodline if you already have a massive influx of people who are of a separate blood. Especially if it gets diluted, like it probably did. Also interesting, this means Delenn was a distant, very, very, very distant descendant of Sinclair. Yeah, let's move on from that thought. There's a surprisingly strong moment. I've mentioned before the relative lack of chemistry between Delenn and Sheridan, but there's a really good scene towards the beginning when she basically sits down with him, says like, look, I need to go do something, and I want you to be here. This is very important to me to finish this. I want to have this final time, this final moment, where I can complete the 3 nights of our traditions. This is important to me, John. And he's like, but then finally he's like, yeah, okay. I like it especially because he doesn't do it because he believes in it. He doesn't do it because he converts, and he doesn't do it because he is forced to. He does it because it's important to her. That is in many ways what a compromise, a relationship of any kind, friendly, familial, or romantic, tends to involve. Okay, let me give you a direct example. I don't like baseball that much. I mean, I liked playing baseball, but I'm not exactly what you call a baseball fanatic. However, I had a friend, this was many years ago, who really liked baseball. So I made it a point to get into baseball, really start to learning. This was about when Jose Canseco was still batting, for those of you who actually know what that means. I made it a point to go out of my way to get into baseball, to really start to know the stats and the functionality of the game and who was batting and when and why and just all that stuff, because it was important to him. And he was my friend, so it mattered to me because it mattered to him. Now, I'm not saying that should be across the board, obviously. There is such a thing as differing interest, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's also nothing wrong with basically picking up a hobby or allowing something or embracing something because it happens to be relevant to someone you care about. And that is exactly what John does in here. Sheridan, excuse me. He flat out is like, okay. He can tell and see that this is something that genuinely matters to her. And he doesn't get it, and he doesn't see the point of it, but he's willing to go with it because it matters to her. I like that. What's also interesting is she never admits the truth to him. Not then, about why she's leaving, and not at the end, about what happened. JMS himself actually talked about that. He gave an interesting point. He said it doesn't matter. Telling the truth at that point doesn't change anything. I did this horrible thing. All that's going to do is cause more hurt. Now, that's an interesting answer, because if I can be so bold, I don't think that's definitively the right answer. I'm not saying there is a definitively right answer, but what I am saying is that it sounds more like that's Delenn's answer in this case. That she is thinking to spare him from pain, to remove the choice of having to deal with that from his mind and from his world, and instead just simply living with the burden herself. Now, if that sounds familiar, then it should. Because she's already done that. She already kept the truth, or at least the potential truth, of Anna Sheridan from him. Remember? And that didn't turn out that great. He was actually more hurt about the fact that she hid it from him than anything else. But then again, and I know this is just going to be a recurring theme, and trust me, it's going to keep coming up. Sheridan's honest. It doesn't occur to him to keep that kind of thing from people. After all, one of the first people he told that he has a 20-year life limit is her. It was very interesting seeing Delenn genuinely scared when she went into the dreaming, by the way. It's very rare we see Delenn actually afraid of anything. This woman is a very strong individual, and she has stood up and dealt with many things in her life. To see her like that was kind of unnerving. I think this was more of an uncertainty thing than genuine fear, but still, it was just, whew, wow. Dekat was an interesting character. First of all, perfect actor for it. They really nailed the actor of Dekat. And he really came across as someone who was charismatic enough and strong enough in personality, strong enough of will, if you will, in order to actually maintain the balance that is needed to be the one of the 9. And It worked. It was great. He even went out of his way to basically shame everyone else using Delenn, and then carried her forward and all this fun other stuff, eventually elevating her to the Great Council, and then dying in her arms. And as he's dying, very Minbari, of course, he's desperately trying to get out the information to her. Listen, oh God, get out of here. And that brings us to the scene. Delenn, in a moment of weakness, orders the death of an untold number of humans. She, in a moment of weakness, gives that order. Now, we can try and talk around this. We can try and, make it as less bad than it actually was. We can do that all day long. Now that we're after the fact, we can look back on it and say, oh, well, this, or oh, if not this, that. But the harsh, simple reality is that in a moment of grief and rage, she ordered the mass slaughter of many, many humans. She did that. Now, I find this very interesting, because one of the things that I have asked you, viewer, in the past is, do you think Londo can be redeemed? Should be redeemed? I ask you the same question. Can Delenn be redeemed? Should Delenn be redeemed? Now, I bring that up because you'd be amazed how few people ask that question. And I find that fascinating. I mean, I hate to say that, but to be blunt, their circumstances are very similar. Hers is a little more truncated. Londo was on a slow descent that eventually led to him accepting things and slowly getting up above his head until he desperately tried to get back out of it. Delenn basically just plunged right into the overhead thing, and then, as we see at the end of the next battle, immediately tried to undo it, and was incapable of doing so. However, as much as there are certainly noteworthy and relevant differences between their circumstances, both characters fell, did something they regretted, and tried to make up for it. And I know what you're going to say. Well, the bombardment of the Narm homeworld is nothing like the Earth Minbari War. To which I say, maybe you should rewatch the Earth Minbari War and how much the Minbari were slaughtering the humans. The Narn actually stood a better chance against the Centauri than the humans did against the Minbari. There's a quote that, I forget his name, one of the Great Council members says. He says, this is a holy war. It can only end in blood. It can only exhaust itself in blood. But the funny thing is, that's true. It basically started exhausting itself in human blood. I don't remember when exactly we learn all the details of this war. I know there's the movie. But one of the things we find out that's most important and most relevant for this purpose is the warrior caste more and more started thinking, why are we doing this? Why are we killing these people? Because the humans, even by Minbari standards, which I remind you are a very proud people with very rigid standards, even by their standards, the humans were behaving honorably and decently and had earned their respect on the battlefield. And more, this obviously was not true for all Minbari, but many Minbari just started questioning this holy war more and being like, why are we doing this? It got to the point where they basically needed an excuse to stop, because of the whole unique nature of Minbari politics. And they got one with Sinclair. Whew! It's a hell of a dice roll. I just find it all fascinating. But more to the point, this also speaks a lot to Delenn's character. Delenn flat out takes responsibility on herself. Now, that is kind of her. She's the kind of, I will do it, self-sacrificing, some would say messianic perspective. But the relevant point is, I've brought up many times recently the difference between the officer and the soldier. For those of you who haven't heard this argument, and this is something that has been debated many, many years in basically all of human history, across all of human history, who's responsible? The soldier who kills someone, or the officer who orders him to? Now, there's a lot of different ways that can be presented, but that is what that question boils down to. And it is a surprisingly complex issue. But not for Delenn. Even though, even though 4 other Grey Council members said, go massacre the humans, she still takes it upon herself as the officer who gave the order, because she was the deciding vote. 4 said yes, 4 said no. 9 can't have an uneven vote. That was on purpose. That was one of the things Sinclair did on purpose. So she was effectively and definitively the one that ordered this, and she knows that, and she doesn't shy away from that. And she flat out says, I have spent all my years since trying to make up for a few seconds of grief and rage. And the best part is she almost can't, can she? Depending on how you define justice. Note, I'm using my own definitions here. Not revenge, not vengeance, but justice. Could she balance the scales on this one? Now, some would argue, yes, she does do a lot of good things for a lot of people. She was instrumental in ending the Shadow War, after all. But a lot of people died in that war. And, of course, there's the unspoken side of this, too. Remember, Sheridan was a war hero in that war. He killed Minbari. Quite a few, actually. Probably more than any other individual human actually managed. At least if you attribute the destruction of the I forget its name to him. So, yeah. I guess my final thoughts, and like I said, it's kind of a breather episode, so I don't have a lot to say. My final thoughts here, regardless of whether or not she should be capable of being redeemed for her actions, and whether or not she should be forgiven, if redemption is possible, if redemption has happened for her for what she's done, I think there's no denying that it's something she actively seeks, and I think this is really important, is not why she's connected to John Sheridan. In fact, it's funny because Lanier flat out lays that out and says, well, obviously you're with John in order to make it up to the humans. To which she says, you don't really believe that, do you? And to which he says, no. Even Lanier, who has a few internal reasons for slanting things or for pushing a certain agenda when it comes to Delenn, still believes Delenn actually, really loves Sheridan. So, that's nice, I guess. I don't know. I suppose we'll see what comes up next week or tomorrow. Again, don't know which. But I'll see you there, guys.